All for coming, and yes, good afternoon and welcome everyone. So we are about to start. I know that we have about 45 or so participants online, so also welcome everyone. I don't know wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So, so my name is Ricky Ponsalan. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Information, as well as the director of the Museum Studies program. I'm happy to introduce today's talk and the open forum that will follow by our distinguished guest, Esteban Rael-Gálvez. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the university's origin in a land grant from the Anishinaabe-speaking peoples, the Bodewademi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, and the Wyandot Nation. Our university benefits from the land, occupied with the promise to provide education and service to the descendants of those peoples, which is a goal that we value and continue to strive toward. Those lands and waters continue to benefit us materially and intellectually and remain a debt of obligation to provide education, benefit, and knowledge to their descendants and all peoples of the state of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Archives, Records, and Digital Curation Research Group, or the ARC Group, which organized the event with the support of the iSchool's Carnegie Fund. The ARC Research Group explores information science from the perspectives of archival studies, digital curation, record keeping, and library science. The group fosters exploration of a wide range of knowledge environments in society, from cultural heritage infrastructure like libraries, archives, and museums to academic scholarship, government, health, and education. The group also sponsors a doctoral seminar and this series of talks, the DIAS, or the Data, Archives, and Information in Society. Today's speaker is Estevan Rael-Gálvez, Executive Director of Native Bound Unbound. Trained as an anthropologist and historian, Dr. Rael-Gálvez previously served as the Senior Vice President of Historic Sites at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Executive Director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and the State Historian of New Mexico. A native son of New Mexico, Esteban was raised on a farm and ranch, stewarded by his family for multiple generations. He received his BA in English Literature and Ethnic Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and he is a Michigan alum. He received his MA and PhD in American Cultures here, where he completed an award-winning doctoral dissertation, which is also the basis of a current book project. Today, he will discuss the work of Native Bound Unbound, the Archive of Indigenous Slavery. Please join me in welcoming Esteban.
Miigwech, Bupuwave, buenos tardes, good afternoon. Let me go ahead and start this, situate myself here. First, let me thank the University of Michigan School of Information, and especially Professor Jesse Johnston for the invitation to share our project as part of the speaker series, Data Archives Information in Society seminar. I've been hoping to engage, should I stand right here? Is this the right place? Okay. Speak a little bit louder? Okay. I've been hoping to engage a department like this one for some time, knowing certainly the reputation of UMSI has, and the focus on this series has on data, archives, and most importantly, I think the value of information in society. Before I share some thoughts, let me begin, as I learned early in life to do, acknowledging the ground upon which we stand today, recognizing the indigenous people who have served as its stewards for millennia. In the sovereign landscape that I come from, I learned very early on, certainly from my Pueblo elders who have said, wherever we go, we leave our breath behind us. An invocation recognizing those who not only came before us, but how their life force remains with us. And every single one of you bring in your own level of breath and surrounded by that, wherever you come from. And so I bring my ancestors into this space with me today. And so today I'm honored to be sharing a monumental project that I've launched and one that I hope to garner your interest, your support, your engagement, particularly as collaborators. Bien dice el dicho que una mano no se lava sola. We work together on these collaborations. But before I share, I wanted to take a bit to reflect on the theme of the seminar. When I think about data in the context of archives, especially data related to slavery, I return often to the question posed by the New York Times columnist Jamel Bouie in his January 28th, 2022 article, "We Still Can't See American Slavery for What It Is." Bouie writes, how exactly do we relate to data that allows someone, anyone, to identify a specific enslaved person? Bouie is writing here in part about Slave Voyage's website and is concerned about how digital tools, especially in quantitative analysis, can sometimes reduce complex lived realities to abstraction. He warns against letting numbers eclipse humanity and urges those of us working in this space to approach our work with care, deep awareness, and respect. So I'm paying attention to how people are thinking about data. For those of us working in Native Bound Unbound, as I hope to make clear, Bowie's caution is not just theoretical. Many of us, I think a third of us working on my team, are descendants ourselves. And while we anticipate that the initiative will surface astronomical numbers that will change how we think about who was enslaved, where they were enslaved, and when they were enslaved. Those it's going to change how we think about this. There will be in the millions. But as I have always said, this is not about numbers. This is about people. So I very much agree with Jamel in how he's cautioning us to think about this. This is about people and their stories. Let me say something about the archive. By now, it is well established that the colonial archive served as a technology of imperial power, conquest, and hegemony. Michel Foucault would rightly point to the colonial archive as a monument to particular configurations of power and point to much of what is contained therein as documents of exclusion. In this way, the archive is about silence. And of course, I think about the Haitian scholar Michel Trouillot that identified how silence enters into the archive at those four critical moments. When the sources are made, when the sources are collected and assembled into the repository, when that information is retrieved, when something happened, when something that happened becomes a story about what is believed to have happened, and finally, when a historian like me sits down and writes history based on the assembled facts, while influenced by the narrative of those facts. While I've dedicated much of my life to working with and even in archives, I've long recognized that at the heart of the archives was the condition of this production of historical knowledge. Decisions made by popes, kings, viceroys, thousands of miles away define the local circumstances of everyday citizens, including the enslaved, as did the reports of governors and clergy back. In this way, it's important to recognize that these records are fallible, subject to errors and ethnocentrisms and of those who are creating them. Recognizing these colonial realities is imperative, but also, as Maori scholar Linda Tuwai Smith has cogently observed, in order to decolonize our histories, we must revisit site by site. Decolonizing does not mean erasing the archive, ignoring it. What it does mean is thinking more critically about these sources, interrogating them, reading them in between the lines, and finding the liminal, those caught in between the lines. It may even require thinking of what Emma Perez calls the decolonial imaginary as a way to overcome the colonial past, recognizing power and yet still critically imagining the lives constructed and obscured and silent within the archive. I think of the very early definition of the word archive given by Sebastián de Corrubias in his 1611 Treasure of the Castilian. He notes, the chest or cabinet where original documents privileged and remembered are held. The kings of Castile steward theirs and the town of Simancas with exceptional organization and protection. In like manner, so do all the noblemen, cities, churches, covenants, and communities. While this definition makes clear how the colonial archive functioned as a privileged site, I like that in the end, it also includes the idea that communities, families, individuals can also create and hold archives. While I can say a lot more about the data, including how we are beginning to collect it, correlate it, disambiguate it, which I will address in a moment, and maybe even during the Q&A, and about how we are thinking about the poetics, the politics of the archive as well. Let me lead into the project by forefronting not only information and society, but the humanity and the information held therein. In taking my cue from my friend Emma Perez, I think of the decolonial imaginary, and I began as I have for decades, even on this campus, imagining the lives of the indigenous enslaved all around me. I think of the sovereign places they perceived at their birth, complex and cradled in ancient civilizations. I think of the places they made their own, imprints upon the natural built and social landscapes, tangible and intangible. There, in the margins, they labored, lived, and even loved, reflecting the resplendent tenacity of spirit and resilience. I think of their names, the ones that their parents gifted them at their birth, reflections of ancestors, meaningful places, or of the futures their parents hoped for this child. I also think of those names that were imposed, often with the sacrament of Christian baptism, following their captivity, irrevocably severing them from everything, everyone, every place that preceded. But these names became their own, and they were often the ones that they passed on to their descendants. I imagine those gradual moments across time and the vast landscape when they finally closed their eyes forever. In this imagining, tracing the arc from their birth to their death, I acknowledge still their breath all around us, and in us, their heirs. Most of these lives are known only because of the imprints left behind. I have followed the work of many who carefully uncover the past, brushing away rock and dirt, pulling back pages and leaning in to listen. My work has allowed me to navigate through the delicacy and strength of memory as an ethnographer and into the deep recesses of the archive as a historian. Here, while some of these lives emerge whole, most surface in mere fragments. a record in a captive sale, in a captive raid, a bill of sale noted among the produce and the hooved animals, the peripheral subject of a trial proceeding, though more often relegated as an object of chattel or chattel in a dispute between men, records written by clerics recording baptisms, marriages, deaths, names and cash shifting based on the whims of men with quills, an enumeration within a census record, a seemingly tangential mention in a last will and testament, the property of another human granted from the ownership of one generation to the next. In archives globally, these men and women were almost never even accorded a name in these narratives, appearing as mere numbers of those bought and sold, present in the farms and factories, producing the goods, tilling the ground, and reaping the harvest of those who actually did inherit the earth. In narratives grand and small, the enslaved almost always exist merely in the margins. History almost always centers upon the lives of the enslavers, those who have have been the primary characters of a story. And the enslaved exist. Oops, did I lose what happened? There it is. History almost, the enslaved are often represented by others not enslaved. Some exist as mere shadows in a story, even as they do in this photograph. Documents and the archives in which they are organized are fallible. They are subject to those biases of those creating them. Memory is also imperfect, and while a telling, sorry about this, and while telling or hearing of a story can misconstrue and shift as it moves across generations, I believe it also retains threads of truth, all worth pulling. Collectively, these archival ethnographic imprints encompass the indelible stories of people, places, moments in time, and when drawn together reflect a unique history. The work of the scholar, storyteller, the artist is to take these imprints and from them add the imperative and the imaginative alike to recover the individual and the collective lives. Still thinking of the archives, I would like to transition to sharing the project, Native Bound Unbound, the project which centers on the recovery of histories of Indigenous people, a project I like to describe as the one that I was born to create, has an origin. One that begins for me with stories, including those that I first heard when I could first lean in and listen to story. When I was a little boy growing up in northern New Mexico, there are three that I would like to share. First, I was pretty young when Alex Haley's Roots premiered on national television. If there is any event that I want to celebrate in 2026, it's the 50th anniversary of this premiere. I was only 7, but the stories deeply impressed upon me this foundational story, perhaps not reflective of my community's narrative, but it was parallel. And as my grandmother always said, when a story is being told well, it should always invite another story to be told. I leaned into these stories. It was so impressed upon me. So many of you are so young, you don't remember that moment when there were only 3 or 4 channels that existed. But those of you laughing, Charles, know that moment. But I was so impressed. And it's a hard story to listen to as a 7-year-old, right? Now that I think back, how did my parents help me navigate through this? But I listened to those stories. I even know some of those lines to this day. It was ingrained in me. In this time, I also had the honor of sitting with elders who have whispered stories, uh, who, some breaking a silence that only happened with old age. My grandma Nea was one of these archives. And in fact, recently someone shared a cassette tape of a story I heard her share dozens of times when we would go visit her in Pueblo. I wept upon hearing her voice as an adult for the first time in 30 years, emanating from a worn cassette shared with me by a cousin. The gentle cadence of her voice rising and falling in a story transported me back to my 5, 6, 7, 10, 15-year-old self, listening to her share about the perseverance of her Pawnee ancestor, of how that story became one of the many to shape her sense of being in this landscape. I actually have the voice, but we can't play it. The critical assessment of those archives encourages us to recognize and locate those sources that historians would not traditionally be used to reconstruct the histories of slavery. I remember when my mother folded a gift she had long stewarded into my arms. A mid-19th century wool blanket, this one, said to have been woven by the hands of my mother's ancestor, an indigenous Dene, a Navajo woman who had been captured as a child and bound within the institution of slavery. I remember thinking about its texture, its colors, and above all, the woman who wove it and what it meant for me, her descendant, to hold it a century and a half after she had created it. As my mother passed it to me, she whispered that it was for knowledge, but also for protection. It signified a recovery of a traumatic experience that had evolved into creativity, a transcendent legacy for me. While this began in this way as a young boy listening to stories, identifying ancestors, I went on to be trained as both ethnographer and historian, immersing myself into the archives. Even without trying, I found many other ancestors. I remember when I was the state historian overseeing the archives, the first time I opened the box that contained a lawsuit between Bartolome Lovato and Cristobal Arellano, a suit for the possession of an Apache slave, one that likely was my own ancestor, Margarita, the matriarch of the Arellanos in northern New Mexico. I wept upon seeing it. I went on to take this very personal story and manifest it into a professional one. I remember working all week at the National Archives in DC, and finally, from the depths of a box on a shelf, I pulled out a particular census that listed the name of 149 individuals enslaved in the villages that had shaped my own youth. A list that would become foundational in my work that I would undertake for decades, recovering the story of these indigenous enslaved. I would complete my doctoral dissertation on this subject. I opened all of those boxes, pulled at folders, moved steadily through the microfilm, letters, court cases, WPA narratives, last wills and testaments, and many thousands of church records, baptisms, marriages, deaths. Eventually and necessarily, I began to recognize what I was finding, placing it into a database to understand who were the enslaved and who were the enslavers, who were their kin, who were their descendants. That database grew to about 30,000 individuals just for New Mexico. What followed was an amazing career, one that I love, but none was truly my work, which is what brings me to this project today, a project that I was born to do. Let me share the framework and jump into it. I keep saying I'm going to jump into this project, but here we are. This is, so when we think, I'm going to frame this around the interrogatives, who is it that we're talking about? We're talking about the indigenous people of the Americas. This is a fresco that was done by Bernardino de Beto. It's a resurrection of Christ. It was done in 1492. It was found, I believe, in the 1980s in the Borgia apartments. Borgia was a pope when Christopher Columbus landed and commissioned this fresco to be done. And I don't think I have, well, maybe I have the image. We'll see. But they're lost in here. But in the tiny, tiny recesses, I don't know if I couldn't point to it necessarily, are 6 individuals depicted. Probably, likely, the first illustration done of enslaved indigenous people. 12 people were actually captured by Columbus and taken across the Atlantic Ocean and presented as gifts to the Catholic monarchs. 6 survived the journey. And those 6 are these individuals who are illustrated here, depicted maybe as dancing. Those Taino people are who this project is about. It's also about Calicho, who was captured in 1577 by Martin Frobisher, the English privateer who searched for the Northwest Passage. Arnak and Nutku, Inuit from Frobisher Bay, a woman in a sealskin parka with a baby in hood. It's these people who were captured and taken across into Europe. It is Malintzin, the woman who would come to be known as Malinche, the mother of all Mexicans, the woman who would give birth in mythology and legend and in truth to the first mestizo child born in Mexico. Sometimes revered, sometimes reviled over the years by different people, but still one of the individuals who was presented as a gift by her own community to the hands of Cortés, along with, I think, about 20 other indigenous women. This story is about Tituba. Even though the crucible would remember her as African, she was actually from likely the coast of Venezuela, taken into Barbados, sold into Barbados, ultimately ending up in the household of the Reverend Parrish living in Salem. And this is her story as well. And she was listed in every single document as the Indian Tituba, along with Indian John. I was able to visit the site of where she lived a couple of weeks ago when I was visiting Salem. This story is about all of these indigenous people. Rosario Romero, who was held by one of the famous priests of New Mexico. This is Delovina Maxwell. This is Juan de Jesus Romero. This is John Carson, Juan Carson. These are the individuals that we are documenting in this project. It is also about where. It's across the Western Hemisphere, but it's all of those people that were taken into Europe as well, places like London and Seville and beyond. And so it's a hemispheric project. That's where we're focusing on, though, as I've told and promised Ricky, because we're starting to identify records in the Archivo General de las Indias that are impacting and recording the people of the Philippines. The project grows and is expanding. And that's a reality with slavery, is that people are being captured and displaced and moved around globally. While my original project was based regionally, you know, the reality of slavery is that people are displaced. And so if we only adhere to regional or national boundaries, we actually miss the point of the impact of the reality of this story. This is the painting that exists on our brochures. By the way, we have some brochures, so I'm happy to hand those out. This was that moment that I've already called attention to when Christopher Columbus presents the indigenous people before the Catholic monarchs. And this is depicted in a romantic way, but obviously this is people being displaced and their lives being forever changed. Slavery, captivity and slavery was happening before the conquest, and it would continue to happen intertribally post-conquest. But European powers, the Dutch, the British, the Portuguese, the French, and the Spanish, changed this exponentially, and it would continue to unfold over the years, all the way into not just descendant, or certainly descendants, but I've traced individuals who are still being listed in the federal census in 1950 in Colorado, still identified as a servant, euphemism for the enslaved, in the household of the grandchildren of their former enslavers. So this would continue to take place all the way into the at least the 1950s, if not beyond. That's centuries that we're tracing this. Okay, so this is the fun part. How are we doing this? This is a whole team approach. I've gathered what I refer to as a constellation of teams. There are archivists, there are researchers, there are scholars of slavery and people who are interested in genealogy who are helping us gather information either online or they're actually working in places like the Archivo General de las Indias in Spain or in local archives. We've already touched base with people here in the archives as well, because I believe there's likely not a single archive, certainly hemispherically, but in many cases globally, that does not have at least one record that is relevant to the project. So we're finding that out. We're working with transcribers, translators. I'll say more about that process. We've developed guidelines and standards. There's been so much work. We have tons of Google Docs and Google Sheets, all to provide guidance to team members. They're just little documents that you can see here. But we're thinking about the ethics behind all of this. What does it mean to gather? How are we systematizing this? How are we standardizing not just names and places, but what's the language that we're looking for? At least under the Spanish Empire, indigenous slavery was made illegal in 1542, and it should have ended right there. So I could only talk about it for a 50-year period or so. But the reality was language and law became a way to obfuscate the reality of the enslaved people. So a whole new vocabulary, all of which will be made available on the website, so you could read that. And we have gathered 100 words, both indigenous language words, but also all the European language. In Spanish alone, there are like at least 30 words that were used. Words like criado, sirviente. Whole new ethnic groups like Genízaro were invented to actually define who these individuals were. But make no mistake, I argue those are nothing more than euphemisms for the word slave, so as not to use it. But so when we're guiding our researchers to what to look for, how to identify that, that's what we're having them look for. There are more instances that I was expecting where the word esclavo does actually appear. but we're gathering all of those type of documents. We are working towards sustaining this project, as you can tell, because it has the audacious goal of working not just in those hemispherically, but across time. We're always working. My primary job is that of a fundraiser. And so it is something I've had to do at least for 20 years for different institutions, but now I can do it for something I truly believe in. And so our primary sponsor and supporter, catalyst, has been the Mellon Foundation, of course, but we're always looking for other funding sources as well, and partnerships, honestly. So I was talking to Jesse this morning about those partnerships and what that looks like. So a partnership is really a multiplying effect to actually bring this together. And that's precisely what these collaborations are all about. I was excited to share that already now for 2.5 years, we've been partnering with StoryCorps to actually gather conversations between descendants, reflecting upon an ancestor who has been enslaved. I think we have 40 conversations that we've gathered so far, and we're just getting started. I love the model, of course, of StoryCorps because it's not an academic interview necessarily. We're doing those as well, but it's a conversation between a mother and a daughter talking about their enslaved ancestor, not just identifying their name, how they came to know who they are, how they imagine their life, but what does that mean for them as a descendant to remember their life? So it's shifting how we think about that. So those oral histories are bringing those ancestors back to life at some level. We launched a robust engagement, even though we've not quite launched the project. But so follow us, even though we've kind of slowed down on our social media. But it's at Nat for Native, at Native Bound Unbound on all kinds of platforms, including ones I barely want to follow anymore. But so X and Facebook and Blue Sky, they're all up there, at least for now. But we've also been doing in-person gatherings, what I call memory workshops, that I'm loving being able to have in community, because that's where you get people not just learning about these things. A lot of people still are interested. This is new to me. We heard about an ancestor, but we don't even know where to begin. Those are ways in which we can start to engage communities and family members in this. And we've started to have those workshops, certainly in localized places, but we're even starting to explore what would a workshop like this be like in a place like Argentina, where we have people doing work, in a place that is different from what I'm used to. But you know, we have a researcher out there working on the 19th century, which is just yesterday, for someone like me who's thinking about like the centuries-long impact of this. But the 19th century, that means that there's still descendants, right? That we can actually start to track. We have 3 researchers working on the 19th century, not just in New Mexico, but the Yucatan. We have Julio Rojas Rodriguez, who's getting his dissertation at Colegio de Mexico. He's Cuban. He's interested in all the people, Maya people, who were taken from the Yucatan into places like Cuba in the 19th century as part of the caste wars. We have Diego, who is working in Argentina also to trace the impact of indigenous people captured in Argentina. Places that at least I wouldn't have thought that we would find the indigenous people, but they're everywhere. They're being impacted. These stories just haven't been surfaced as much. This is kind of our process. I know these are tiny little documents at the bottom of your screen here. we're starting with that research, but we're also transcribing all of these records. We're doing it puro mano, right? Hand by hand right now. We have a research team who is tracking this, and it's an incredible team that is transcribing them. We're also starting to explore what would this look like if we brought AI into the picture to support this. And AI, in terms of those language models, is not quite there yet. It's only giving us about 80% accuracy, and that's not very good, actually. But we believe that we can actually get to at least 95% accuracy. We're exploring that. We're translating all of these documents. So all be in English at some point. Someone has asked me in one of these seminars, like, well, are you going to eventually transcribe French documents into Portuguese, Portuguese records into Spanish? At some point when I continue to get funding for that, absolutely, because this project at the core is about accessibility. We're taking that data and we're encoding it, we're marking it. You guys know this language much better than I do. And we're marking people's names, places, and the events so that we can correlate and data associate or disambiguate. In many cases, there's a bazillion Marias. We likely can't connect those. But if there's a Jose Lorenzo that lived in this place at the same time as this Lorenzo, that we're correlating that and we're bringing those documents together in some part so that we can tell the full lives of people. Here's this snapshot of where the team is now working, but I hope this expands. Sometimes it sounds like I'm bragging to say that we have 70 people, but now you know that that's not enough. We need 7,000 people at least working on the project. And ultimately, it will manifest in a digital initiative that is this project that we hope to launch within a couple of months. In a way, I feel like I'm kind of launching it here a little bit, but it'll be online. You can actually go to the site right now, but we only have a holding page, nativeboundunbound.org. I've already mentioned that we're going to have that terminology all accessible to researchers interested in as part of transparency to be able to show what this looks like. We'll have a chronology of Indigenous slavery, all accessible to the public. I'm getting to an end here. We'll have a bibliography. What was amazing about assembling this bibliography for me, I mean, I've been in the field. I know that there's a level of scholarship. What I didn't fully know is the comparative scholarship in places like Brazil or in Latin America. It's immense. I mean, the chronology that we've built just in a Word document to begin with is 100 pages. That's a lot of work for a narrative not to have yet shifted in terms of a national consciousness or narrative about the reality of Native American indigenous slavery. In places like Mexico, it is known as a foundational narrative, but it's every bit a foundational narrative in a place like the United States. Here's what this looks like. This is me saying web launch in 2025. You'll be able to explore the data, the information, the documents in 4 different navigations. You'll be able to identify enslavers. You can type in a name like Gallegos or Smith, or you can type in a tribal identifier. I want to know all the people who are Comanche or Potawatomi, and be able to identify those individuals. A whole section will be devoted to archival records, where we'll be able to share and explore a whole baptismal book. But we're taking that baptismal book and we're sort of deconstructing it to actually identify the relevant pages. But in a place like New Mexico, at least, or Veracruz, Mexico, or in Peru, You can't open a baptismal book and not find at least one indigenous enslaved person listed on every single page. Again, to show how much this was actually taking place. So you'll be able to look at all of the different records. You'll be able to, there's up here, there's a little toggle line where you'll see the transcription and the translation. So if you don't believe us, you can read the transcription, you can read the translation and see how we're sharing this. This what it will look like. It will highlight the specific entry and you'll be able to explore this. You've already seen that I'm interested in type of sources that we can use to actually show this. So we're gathering object stories to actually be able to tell this story as well. We're gathering illustrations and maps and voices and videos. Anything, we're gathering anything that tells us about indigenous slavery in the story section. Songs, stories. And even though the site may or may not launch with this section on places, we're interested in the architecture and the geography of indigenous slavery. And so you'll be able to find architectural features at some point in all of this. Okay, so when Elizabeth Alexander from the Mellon Foundation asked me, who are you doing this for? I said this, we're creating a site that is going to be accessible to the general public. It'll change scholarship, I hope. For the first time, scholars, like say you're a scholar and you can't read Spanish language records, now you'll be able to. One of my researchers said, Estevan, you haven't even finished your book and we're giving this all away. I said, that's the point. That's what Mellon, and that's what the descendants particularly deserve, to actually have this information. For me, the paradigm that often exists within universities of like, I got to get my book out first, that's not my paradigm. And that's not the paradigm of this project. We are going to give it away because it already belongs to those people. But I want monographs and books to come out of this. It's going to be accessible to educators. We're going to build a curriculum model in spite of the existing climate. We're going to create educational curriculum out of this. And artists, we're building a well. I want librettos and sculptures and all kinds of things to be able to come from this. But the answer was singular. I said, we're doing this for indigenous communities who were impacted by this, including indigenous communities that do not exist anymore, but those that do will understand that ache that exists within the community of loss is real and can be situated within this project. But my North Star in many ways are the descendants, people whose aching consciousness, even whether it's known or unknown, connects them in the past to these ancestors who survived and allowed me to be here today as heirs to this entire project. I've already shared like our social media. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. 44 minutes or so. And I'd love to take some questions if I could. Can I get some water? Oh, thank you. I didn't even see this.
Yeah, so we actually have the room until 1:30, so I could moderate the questions until then. So Jesse is monitoring the Zoom room. So those who are on Zoom, could you please, if you have questions, type in your questions or just raise your hand if you want to speak. And also, those who are in the room asking questions, please use the microphone so that people online could hear you. So I have extra mic.
I should stay here, right? Like not
Yeah,
move.
so
I
that
tend
people
to
could see.
move. Okay.
Yeah, but the camera doesn't.
But I won't be on
You
camera.
can, I think, stand here and people could still see you, right?
No, I think.
Yes, you can.
Oh,
Yeah, like you don't see yourself in your. on
Hi. Any questions? Any thoughts? Yes. William,
William.
compadre.
I had the fortune to see you yesterday during your presentation in the law school. Something that is fascinating is that you're navigating interstices space between different fields, archive, African American studies, diaspora studies, Latino studies. And at one point, you were sharing with us a little bit how difficult it is to help, for example, Latinos to recognize this is part of Latino history sometimes. Um, so how are you navigating this kind of, because part of the problem that we have is that even the definitions that we have in the fields are just not working. Latino studies, Latin American studies, as two different fields, it's not a reality of people. So I'm interested in how you are navigating that one, mostly because a lot of our students are dealing with the same questions, how to cross between fields in a way to get validation and recognition and the work can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William. I I um I think of a couple of things. That first, the work that I'm doing is interdisciplinary already. Like it reflects not only my training and my commitment to interdisciplinary studies, but how I was raised. Um, and that's why I always mention that I was raised on a farm, even though I was a terrible farmer and rancher. But I recognized at an early age that everything is connected. And if you actually start to think about it narrowly in a certain way, like you miss a whole side of things. So when I was being trained at the law school, did a year and a half at the University of Michigan Law School, like I was interested in all of those issues from a very particular angle, thinking of property, and how it gets shaped. So for me, it's always trying to understand so the various perspectives and ways of seeing this absence, the disciplines. The disciplines in many ways were created as part of the empire, right? So for me, it's actually deconstructing that to actually get to the core of the story. My focus is laser on those individuals. That's one thing I wanted to just say, and I'm not sure if that's answering your question. But as I think about like the ways that we start to divide ourselves up in, along these different divides, Latino, Latinx, Chicano, whatever, African American, that I mean, there's a reason for that in a context. I don't mean to dismiss that, but it also reminds me of the records that we're looking at that are caste categories, right? As we're starting to look at these records where someone is listed as a mulatto, or all of those different caste categories that exist even in a place like New Mexico, let alone in a place like Veracruz, where they're much more robust. We have terms like salteatra, we had colores quebrados, broken colors, colores revueltos, mixed colors. What do you do with a category like that? So for me, we're collecting those because I think, as I say to the team, wherever there's smoke, there's fire. These caste categories that shift, by the way, actually is a way of the archive disappearing people. And so, and here's one more reality that I'll talk about, that, I pointed to the fact that this is a parallel story to the one that we know in the US more of as African American slavery. But in a place like even Chihuahua, northern Mexico, let alone Veracruz, you can open up a sacramental book and not find um, individuals who are being blended communities. Someone who is listed as African married to someone who is indigenous. These are not only parallel stories, but they're deeply woven together. And if we don't start talking about those realities in this way, including how we talk about Latinos, more Latinos have to be talking to African Americans, talking to indigenous people, understanding what these sources tell us. I don't know if that answered your question at all, William.
I think we have a question from Zoom so that Jesse will read.
Yeah, thanks. We'll try to alternate as much as possible. So there's one comment from Grace Galvin to thank you for the quote, "Do not let numbers eclipse humanity," which also stood out to me. So I just will relay that. But there's another question about intellectual property and sort of how it relates to laws and archival records. So I think on one of the slides you had a document that addresses some of that. So there's interest in that. And also how the newer materials, like the interviews and oral histories that you're producing, are they just for the communities? And how do you recommend navigating these kinds of restrictions around traditional knowledge?
It's such a good question. So let me take maybe the latter part before I take on the intellectual property part. Yes, there was a slide. So someone who could read tiny print maybe saw that as we navigating that. Good for you, someone online. I don't think the audience here could actually read that. We've started to develop, and this was something I started developing probably 4 years ago, how to think about the traditional knowledge and how it gets collected and archived. So we're working in those communities to actually determine whether those individuals want to share or not share those things. I mean, when I go into those memory gathering workshops that we've developed, you know, I say, we're here to actually create a process and a platform for you to engage in sharing these stories. But if you decide even afterwards that a story that you've shared is not for public consumption, I may be sad that you don't want to share that, but that's up to you, right? If you don't want to share that. So we have all those forms allowing us, giving us consent or not. And we're determining whether we're doing that. Like even all the stories that are being gathered by StoryCorps, there's one person out of one set of individuals who have decided, of the 40 that we've collected, that they decided that they don't really want to share. That's up to them. Other material that is being gathered right now, we're even trying to think about, like, or what does it mean that you know, these records that are private or public actually may implicate someone, particularly in a family who were enslavers. I'm thinking about that, but that hasn't yet come up, maybe because all the material isn't out there yet. But I mean, a lot of those records already exist on a site like Family Search, but we're just reorganizing them. So we don't have all the answers to the question that was asked about, like, thinking about how that knowledge is made accessible or not, but we're navigating through that, and we want to think that through, particularly in and with communities. The intellectual rights for this material is also something that we're navigating. I mean, most of the material that we're gathering is older, right? It's older than 1927, certainly. So for the most part, they're public records. In some cases, we're working with either archives or museums to generate consent to allow us to actually put that material up online. And so that's where we're at now. But, you know, I'm navigating through all of these laws and tough questions to actually what it means to decolonize an archive, but also share it publicly.
Do we have questions in the room?
Thank you. So this is an incredible project, and I'm really excited to learn all that we have about this. My question's about the, I guess, scope of the project. So you've talked about how this is expanded quite a bit, you know, in orders of magnitude in many ways. But are there any ways in which it has had to contract temporally or geographically, or because of other factors that perhaps I'm not thinking of right now?
Such a good question. One that occasionally some of our team asks, are we contracting at all? It is a good question. And in fact, when it launches, the reality is it may actually look a little bit contracted because we've created a process for which items, like say documents, are being identified, found in archives. They're then the next step, and you saw that process, they're being digitized, then they are sent to the transcription team, so translation team coded. And right now, that process, when we look at it online, 'cause we have a spreadsheet, of course, for this, a lot of material is going to be based in just a 2 or 3 regions, even though we're actually working in about 12 regions. But because that material won't be made available immediately, it's like all of the material that we've started to digitize or identify from Spain are long documents, 300-page documents. So the transcription team hasn't actually finished, they've finished 5 of those or something like that. But we have 1,000 documents that are in the pipeline. So it'll start to feel that way. That's not exactly the question that you've asked in terms of how do we start to contract. I admittedly have not thought necessarily of contracting necessarily. You know, the contraction may come if it's necessarily come because of funding sources. You know, I want to be, you've seen that I want to actually document historic sites, place-based research. And right now, I can't announce it yet, but we've received a small fellowship to actually focus, our small grant to focus on place-based research, but it's regional. You know, so it means that we have to contract that there and we can't expand it to other places where I really want, at least not based on the existing funding model. So it's a really great question, and I'm sure my team is like really happy that you asked it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any more question online, Jesse? Okay.
Yeah, we do have a few. I'll kind of put 2 together. One is, I think, a request to tell about what would be the best way for people to contribute if they want to be involved with the project. And it's kind of couched in a general thank you about the project.
I love, love, love that offer always. We need many, many hands. Right now, there are some people who are on, who are actual researchers, but we have tons of volunteers, about 40 volunteers who are working in different ways. Some folks, a core of those volunteers are working in transcription. We've only put up we're using a platform that exists out there called From the Page. So if you go, you know, it's a crowdsourcing platform. So if you go on to From the Page and look up our project, Native Bound Unbound, you'll find us there. And so and there are all kinds of documents that are being put up, not just Spanish language 16th century. In fact, we just put up a bunch of newspapers, advertisements of enslaved people from the Massachusetts area that just need to be transcribed. So if anyone is interested in helping us in that level, in that way, certainly we would appreciate that. That helps us tremendously. You know, we've had volunteers come forward who say, you know, I happen to be a retired fundraiser. Do you need help? Yes, we do. So whatever. Yeah, I often say, no matter what your skill set is, what your interest or experience is, we will find a place for you in this project. So how to contact us? So info, I'll say this slowly, info, or if someone can type it into the chat, info@nativeboundunbound.org. And write to us if you're at all interested in participating. Maybe we can find some funding for you, but if you're interested in volunteering in any way, we'll also find a place for you on this project. We would greatly appreciate you writing to us and saying that you would be interested in participating. It could be 2-3 hours a week. You know, encoding takes a long time, as those of you from this department know. Marking people's names, all of that is being done for the project. Anyone interested in that type of work, and you have like a couple of hours that you want to donate to this in that level, oh my God, we would be so grateful if you would help us in that way. Again, any number of hours a week, we'll train you, we'll provide you an onboarding, and we'll be forever grateful.
Any, David?
Yeah. I have a bigger question about ethics, but I'm more in this other question. So, you know, you talk about this finding these sources and it's infinitely expanding and you're just marching out and out. The thing that struck me when you were talking about developing this vocabulary, about this, the need to revisit some of these pathways. So I'm wondering, is that one of the struggles, just like operationally, that as you're learning new vocabulary, maybe we missed this out on the first round, first run? Is there any like reflection back, or is it just kind of going forward?
No, there's always reflection going back and thinking about like, okay, because we weren't looking for that word in that set of records, what do? We go back. We do go back. We've already started to do that because again, even though that like we march forward, but it comes back to what I reflected on in terms of Jamel's sort of caution to us. If we don't understand and recognize the individual and the humanity within this, and we've missed people, then we've missed people. We have to go back. I mean, I believe in that heart and soul, and that could feel jarring, you know, but it's still our commitment.
But how often are you finding these things as you do?
The vocabulary, it's true that we've actually, building the vocabulary list has been a process, but I had already had that list. So for working with Spanish records for a long time. So and that's really where the bulk of the researchers have worked. Working off of those either euphemisms or caste categories. So I had already developed that long before we brought on researchers to start to look for them. So up until now, we actually haven't found a lot of that.
Jesse, do you have a question on that?
Yes, there is a hand raised from Imani Grodsky. So we'll see if we can get the audio in the room if you'd like to ask your question aloud. You should have the ability to turn on your audio.
Or unmuting yourself, Imani. There you go. Maybe. No?
We're not hearing anything in the room, so maybe what would be best is if you can type your question. I'll try to relay it in the Q&A.
Yeah.
But while we're waiting for that, there is another bigger question here. This is coming in from someone who identified themselves as a current master's student in archival studies here, who would love any words of encouragement, and how do you stay optimistic about continuing your work in the current political climate?
Such a good question. We're living in this moment where it feels not just the financial support, but the telling of untold stories feels more challenging than ever before. And I remain optimistic because I mean, we've been here before, right? It's not like this challenge to tell these untold stories is new. For one, within these circles, it feels different for my generation, but at the same time, when I talk to my 98-year-old father, he remembers those times when he wasn't allowed to go into those spaces, right? So like he was having to navigate what I would have to navigate in terms of systemic racism, he was having to navigate that in real time. And so the fact that I have parents that old is a reminder sometimes to like the realities of those, let alone an ancestor who had been captured and enslaved. And so that what provides the fire in my belly. Someone asked me, would get almost a similar question. Given that political climate, is there a way for you to kind of stay under the radar and kind of like surf this out or whatever? And my immediate response, in spite of the challenge, is no. I mean, we're trying to unobscure a story that has been long obscured. And I don't want to stay under the radar. Like, I want to keep moving forward. I know that maybe sound not only crazy, bold, but like naive or something to the existing realities out there right now. But this is why we actually have to not shirk or fly under the radar. We actually have to strengthen numbers, right? Again, a reminder of what I grew up knowing. When you're faced with a challenge, call your cousins, right? Call the cousins in, call the uncles and aunts. And in a way, like same sort of thing here, we need volunteers. If our funding diminishes, we're going to keep this project running and we're going to find a way to actually move it forward, even if it is in a way not as fast as I wanted, but we're doing it. We're going to do it with a respectful speed, right? In that way. So I don't know. I'm not daunted by it. Cognizant of it, but not daunted by it.
Any more questions?
There is one more online, and I'll position this how I understand it. This is from Luis Tabaka, I think, at the law school. And I think the question, the way I understand it, is really kind of about what we would call authority control in libraries and archives, which is this terminology and how you appropriately describe and reference groups or people or names or times, places, events, etc. But he asks, it seems that many of the tribes might be represented in the archives, but no longer be political or social entities into which Native communities are organized or recognized. In destabilized North America, post-1500s, there's Huron migrations. Now they barely survive and are in Kansas City rather than here in this part of Michigan, conquests, etc. So could you talk a little about how to best think about including current communities, how those kinds of connections are represented, and how much should we capture in continuing to use the colonizers' record keeping or political beliefs or labels?
Ambassador C. Tabaka, thank you for a challenging question. You know, the reality is that those structures that divided these communities up are in large part based on those colonial models to begin with. And without giving a whole new lecture on that, I will start to say that, you know, let me just localize it in terms of New Mexico. Prior to the conquest in 1598 of New Mexico, there were over 100 Puebloan communities. There are 19 sovereign Pueblo communities today that survived that onslaught. All of those, and you know, a community. There were 3 pueblos near Santa Fe. One was came to be known as San Cristobal. None of those pueblos exist today. And yet those individuals, including Pecos Pueblo, the descendants of Pecos Pueblo ended up in Jemez Pueblo over time. reconstituting themselves with their cousins. They got together with their cousins, and Jemez Pueblo today is recognized with those joint roots of Pecos and Jemez. The people from San Cristobal, many of those individuals reconstituted themselves in places like Chimayo, what are known as Hispanic villages today. And so either way, as we explore these sources for those individuals who were captured and displaced, we are looking to those communities, whether they're tribal, whether they're federally recognized or not. I mean, in a place like Mexico, there are no federal recognition of tribes. And so we're exploring what those indigenous communities, whether they're still indigenous communities intact in a place like San Cristobal de la Chiapas, or whether they have become these, quote, Hispanicized villages. But we're exploring what the record tells us as we start to constitute that, which brings me to the next part of that question. It's true, and I spoke about this earlier, as I started out to think about, like, this is a colonial archive, right? These are Spanish records. And, it's subject to all of that bias, ethnocentrism. They're written by clerics who have a very particular take on this. And do we believe them? No, as I said earlier in the talk, we interrogate those. We at least set them in context to try and understand. This was written by a man by the name of Jose Antonio, for instance, Martinez, who had 5 enslaved people in his own household. And so every single record that he was writing to represent those people that he's baptizing, marrying, or burying are subject to that, and they have their own take on that. But at the same time, if we don't revisit site by site, as Linda Smith reminds us to do, then we have nothing to work from. So it's true that we have to recognize the context of the colonial archive and how it functioned, what it erased and obscured. You've already heard me say that caste categories or different terminology was used to actually disappear people into the archive. So that's us thinking hopefully more critically of these sources. But at the same time, they're there. I heard someone say, you must be having a tough time finding records. There must be no records of there's billions of records. It's just trying to identify those records and put them into our pipeline and then contextualize them. It's a very tough question, but at the same time, I actually think we risk greater abstraction, that is abstracting that history, if we don't identify those records to begin with.
Do we have any more questions? Last question from David. Okay.
Sorry, get 2 bites of the apple. So the ethics thing really is striking. It's sort of a little bit obscure on this side of it, wondering. So what were the most compelling ethical issues that you felt like? It seems like you developed documentation and processes. What were some of the most compelling ethical issues that you felt obligated to kind of deal with as a team and kind of get people on board as a common way of thinking through it?
David, thank you for that question. Two things come to mind for me. Is there's an incredible violence that is embedded in a lot of these documents. I mean, there's already the violence of enslavement, a baptism of a child who is identified as Kiowa, parents unknown, right? So there's already the violence of slavery. But there's some documents, particularly court records, that actually reveal or illustrate the violence of rape and graphic sort of representations. So, and someone said, well, you can't show those, right? You can't reveal those. And I think what I grabbed, and you heard me mention early in the talk, that decolonizing the archive is not erasing it. At least that's what I believe. And we've had these conversations in the team. What would it mean to not show it, but just talk about it? Well, then we actually risk people saying, does it exist? I mean, you're talking about a rape or something that happened, but like, does that exist? And so we are making it public. We're just putting trigger warnings, and that's the way we've ended up dealing with this issue. I don't know if that's the right approach, but it's how I believe in it, right? If we erase the archive and don't acknowledge what was written down, I think it phases into a new level of disappearance for me, the way I think about it and the way the team has started to explore that. That's one part of my answer to the question, and something that we've grappled with a great deal. I'm also conscious of the team. This is hard work. I have been doing this for at least 30 years, navigating through these records. And at the end of the day, you're kind of overwhelmed by having read through all of this. And whether you're identifying them, you're transcribing those records, or translating them, you're still having to navigate, pick them up, and deal with it. It reminds me of my dear friend, brother, who is out there listening, I hope, Eddie Lantin, Chacon Lantin, who for years has worked as a body worker. And I remember him talking about the need to actually clean that off at the end of the day, because you're touching these bodies who are dealing with pain at the very least, let alone traumas that have been absorbed. Hope that's okay to talk about, Eddie. But I think about it in that same way as we're looking at this material. I have to remind myself, just because I'm not unmoved, still after 30 years, by how hard this is, I'm still astonished in the worst way possible at the level of violence, because I'm focusing on that one individual. I'm still astonished, but they're members of my team for whom this is new, right? To be able to navigate through this material. I'm conscious of the people who also read it. But, so I try to remind my team that, like, you have to step away from this sometimes, right? And sometimes that may be permanently, but like, I want you to understand what we're working on. So I try to have those conversations in our community, in the team. And for me, that's an ethical way to navigate through this.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank Esteban for a wonderful lecture. And those who are online as well, thank you. And we will have more events under DIAS next year. So please stay tuned with our announcement. I think there's more food, so if you're inclined.